Good morning and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. I'm very happy to be back, and once again, I am Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical. I am still hoping that Connor Exum will join us today. If he doesn't, it's my fault he forgot. Yuri Smouter almost did forget, and I fortunately checked in time for him to be here. How are you doing today, Yuri?
I'm doing great, Chris. It's always an honor to be on the show. Very excited about the topics we're going to be exploring, and overall doing great. Just let your audience know, since I am what we call a returning champion, since I'm often invited to come on your program. I've been getting much better sleep these days. I'm actually listening to my body when it says it's tired, and since I am still struggling with sleep apnea, I actually do listen to it. So the past couple of days, I've been finding myself going to bed, if not 10 p.m., if not 11 p.m., certainly like midnight, 1 in the morning. I actually go to sleep and then wake up
Yeah.
wonderfully at 6 or 7 or 8 a.m. and it's doing very good for my mental health. So yeah, all good.
I bet that would be making a difference, and I'm really glad to hear it. Our main topic today is still going to be Catholic Church stuff. The fact that we've got a new pope and various overarching political and historical context for the Catholic Church and what it represents in sort of this modern Western imperialist world. But I wanted to comment on something that happened in the news this week, just because it really jumped out at me when I saw it.
Oh, well,
And
what's that?
I don't know how familiar you are with the Kurdistan Workers' Party in Turkey.
Oh, yes, yeah.
They were founded by Abdullah Öcalan in the early 80s as a Marxist-Leninist Kurdish nationalist movement. He was kidnapped by the Turkish government and locked in prison in 1988.
Still a political prisoner?
And he's been a political prisoner ever since. While he was in prison, he became pen pals with Murray Bookchin and had an ideological transformation from Marxist-Leninism to social ecology. And he wrote a bunch of books elaborating on Bookchin from what I could best call third worldist Marxist-Leninist perspective,
Interesting.
but also expanding from that third worldist Marxist-Leninist perspective into a universalist, democratic, confederalist view of social ecology. And Öcalan literally wrote the book on democratic confederalism, one of the first books that that was his third book after his ideological change. He's written a lot of books in prison. I recommend them to everyone. But
Interesting.
he's tried to work for peace with the Turkish government a couple of times in the past, but this time it's a big deal because, one, he has said that the armed struggle is over and that the PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party, should disband and join secular social democratic parties in Turkey.
Mm-hmm.
And the PKK has responded saying, yes, we're going to lay down arms.
Interesting.
So that's a big deal. It pretty much means the end of the active armed political and class struggle against the Turkish ruling class by the Kurdish working class in Turkey itself.
Yeah.
It means the end of a separate Kurdish national struggle in Turkey. It means the end of an active revolutionary resistance to the Turkish state at a time when the Turkish state seems to be retrenching itself as extremely Islamo-nationalist in sort of the worst ways that harken back to the World War I era of the Young Turks. And it seems like bad timing for the Kurds to suddenly lay down their arms. But it also kind of makes sense in the perspective of we've seen ISIS win in Syria now. We've seen the Kurds in Syria make a decision to come to terms with the new Syrian government. So basically, Rojava is trying to come to terms with ISIS. How backwards can you get?
Not
And
the first
if
time
the,
that's
if the
happened.
Syrian Kurds are in a position as their only choice is to make common cause with either the ISIS government of Syria or the Turkish invader, then you got to figure that the Syrian Kurds are going to side with the ISIS government of Syria against the Turkish invader. And then at the same time, you've got to figure that the Turkish Kurds figure the best way that they can help the Syrian Kurds is to find a way to politically influence the Syrian Kurds, the Turkish sponsor of ISIS in Syria.
Yeah, no, should I jump in?
Yes, you should jump in now. Your thoughts, please.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, if I can compare what the Kurdish if I can compare what the Kurdish resistance, which is very left leaning, if I can compare what they're doing, I think it reminds me. One sec. I think it reminds me a lot of when FARC, which was also Marxist-Leninist, laid down their arms against the fascistic far-right Colombian government and its very, very far-right military, both military and the police. I think it opens up a whole can of worms on what is the best way forward for a better society, a better country. Is it the armed resistance route, or is it the nonviolence? We play the game of democracy and whatnot, and and I think it's interesting what the Kurds in Turkey are doing. I would say that unfortunately armed resistance did not help their cause, although there were sympathetic people, sympathetic voices, like yours truly, Professor Noam Chomsky, who I don't agree with on everything, but what I do agree with him on, uh, which is another topic for a whole nother day. But yeah, I think it opens up a whole can of worms on what is the best way forward: armed resistance or playing the game of democracy. And if you look at what the Kurds did in armed resistance, along with FARC, along with the provisional IRA of Northern Ireland, and this will probably be very controversial, but even Palestinian armed resistance, a lot of the times, and I've always asked this question to those on the left who think that some wars are justifiable, I always say the following: look, I am sympathetic to the IRA. I'm even sympathetic to the Kurdish armed resistance, sympathetic to FARC and whatnot. But oftentimes, when the IRA blows up a pub in England, when FARC engages in kidnapping, when the Kurds would do similar things, oftentimes the very people they were hoping would be converted to their cause only ended up supporting the very reactionary state that they claim they want their grievances addressed and so forth. So I think the Kurds woke up and smelled the coffee that, okay, armed resistance simply isn't working. Let's try this. Let's try playing the game of democracy. And in Colombia, even though those who are involved in union movements, those who are involved in different people power movement, whether it's the Black Power movement, indigenous struggle movement, even though they're still being murdered with impunity, there is a left-wing government in Colombia which is trying to address those grievances. I think it's doing the best it can, despite Western imperialism still meddling its ugly head in Colombia. And
Colombia.
I just hope that with the Kurds doing nonviolent struggle, I hope that their agenda will be advanced, and that Turkey sees that there is no problem with having multiple nationalities, multiple languages, and that Turkey would be and that Turkey itself would be an even better country if they actually make peace with their Christian minorities, their Kurdish minorities. Well, not even minorities. It's a huge, huge chunk of people and whatnot.
So actually, so let's talk about that, because there is a perfect analogy. If you go by the percentage of population, Kurds are to Turkey as Black Americans are to the United States. They are the largest individual minority group in the country, and they form a significant portion of the population in every urban and suburban center.
Yeah.
And they form a majority of the population in certain regions of the country.
Particularly southeast, I believe.
Yes, but there are also some other places where they are that aren't where they traditionally come from, because it's where the Ottoman Empire sent Kurds they were angry at. Like the Syrian Kurds are in Syria because they were exiled from Anatolia for being too anti-Ottoman.
Interesting.
So yeah, I've always found that. Now, one of the other great supporters of Rojava and the Kurdish struggle was the late David Graeber.
Yeah.
His widow is a correspondent of mine on Twitter, and we sort of lightly discussed some of this back and forth in messages. And one thing that she mentioned, and that I think is worth commenting on, is that the Kurdish struggle might actually assume more national prominence and importance if, as a result of whatever peace deal happens, Abdullah Öcalan gets out of prison and becomes a more publicly active and less isolated figure. There have been some
inroads,
rumbles that Öcalan might get out of prison if the PKK really does lay down arms, disband, everything really does stop. If Öcalan really does get out of prison, that may make a big difference as far as Turkish and international politics goes. If the PKK, in whatever form it takes in the Turkish secular democracy, is able to make some sort of political inroads or revitalize the left or some such optimistic mumbo jumbo. But at the same time, I tend to agree with the Trotskyist news source that I got the story from.
World Socialist website, yeah.
The World Socialist website, that's correct.
Which I believe has a very small branch, Socialist Equality Party of Turkey.
They don't have a huge presence in any country. I think their biggest presences are Germany, the US, the UK, Australia. But yeah. I know they do have a Turkish section that is active and that publishes a lot of material about Turkish news and politics on the website. So I don't want to in any way undersell the work they do when it comes to independent socialist media. They're very disciplined. They stick to their party line. They continue to give good information as best they can in the context of their ideological analysis.
Yeah,
I'm not a Trotskyist, but I like their work.
Oh yeah, I appreciate some of the work they've done. I've even had members. I had Chris Marsden, the General Secretary of the SCP in Britain. I've had him on the program. I've had many times Thomas Peters and John Braddock of the New Zealand brand, which is the Socialist Equality Group. They're not a political party yet. Had them on the on 1+1 many times. Always very great. And I've had two members of the Australian.
I have had a friendly acquaintance with Joseph Kishore.
Yeah.
Going back to 2020. I've had him on every incarnation of every show I've done at least once.
That's good. That's great.
I have spoken with Eric London a few times on the show. And in one of my best shows, I had their candidate for UAW president, Will Lehman,
oh, fantastic.
on the show to talk about his candidacy for the UAW presidency when he was running.
And if I was in much better health, I would actually be binge watching all those stuff. But these days, a lot of the guys.
We're having some technical difficulties. Is that you or is that me? Yuri, are you okay? You there? Looks like Yuri's having some technical issues. Hopefully we'll be able to get him back in a moment or two. I am, and yes, all right. The chat is telling me that it does look like it is his connection so hopefully he will be able to return soon. It doesn't look like Connor is joining us. There we go.
Sorry about that. My internet got cut off, but
it happens.
But yeah. Yeah, something I wanted to say, though, going back to Turkey and the Kurdish left nationalist or multi-racial movement there, is I talked with a friend of mine who's a longtime British trade unionist, certainly a Marxist. He doesn't want to box himself into Trotskyist, Marxist, Leninist. So Pat Byrne, who's involved in a lot of anti-New Cold War movements and so forth. He spends a great deal of time in Turkey. He also spent a great deal of time in Greece and knows many people involved in the unions in Greece, Cyprus, and Turkey. And he says at the moment, the left is very, very weak in Turkey. And Berlin, which is a place I frequent because I have a family there, I went to a guy who's part of the German left movement, including the far left. He is a member of World Beyond War. He runs the Berlin chapter of World Beyond War Germany. And I went to the very nice bar cafe he runs, which people should check out. And I actually met two Turkish leftists there who told me that, yeah, at the moment, the Turkish left is very, very weak. But Rick Sterling, who does a lot of great Syria solidarity, well, he's a great anti-imperialist work, and a lot of his journalism, a lot of his beat is Syria. And he talked about, I once had him on a program where we talked about both Turkey and Israel's role in the Western Gulf aggression against Syria. And he told me that actually the Kurds in Turkey particularly, who are different from Kurdish independence movements in both Iraq and Syria and so forth, although you might disagree on that.
So different but linked.
Yeah.
The Syrian movement is independent of Öcalan, but adopted his political philosophy, and Rojava operates according to his books and theory.
Yeah, and Rick was saying to me that a lot of the or the umbrella
All right. It looks like Yuri's having some internet issues again. I appreciate everybody who's hanging in there with us. I apologize for the surprises and the technical difficulties. And hopefully things will improve a little. I am hopeful. In the meantime, I want to note that I was saying I agree with the Trotskyist World Socialist website that the PKK laying down its arms at this point in time is kind of a defeat. It shows the weakness of a sort of singularly nationalist mindset and a lack of more international and strictly class-based principles. And it would be better if that struggle were continuing in some way outside of the political system. But I also understand the idea that O'Callaghan might be more relevant out of prison, and I don't know what to think about it in the end. Welcome back, Yuri.
Yeah, sorry about that. My internet got cut off again. No, anyways, long story short, what I wanted to say, what Rick was relating to me, was that the Kurdish left movement is very inclusive and is trying to work with other Turkish leftist secular parties to advance a left agenda in Turkey, which is so badly needed in Turkey. I mean, Ataturk, there are some good sides to Ataturk, but he did get the ball rolling on Turkish ethno-nationalism with Islamic characteristic, which is very discriminatory towards Armenian Turks, towards Greek Turks, towards Christian Turks, towards Kurdish Turks, and so forth like that. And Ataturk also got the ball rolling on basically folks not being allowed to criticize the Turkish state past or present. So if you say that there was the Armenian genocide and that the Young Turks did it, you're thrown in jail. Well, you speak out against the Turkish government, you are easily thrown in jail. Your journalist publication is going to feel the full wrath of the Turkish state. And Ataturk got that ball rolling. So it makes perfect sense when a far-right junta backed by the West gets into power, they do that full-fledged. And even though Turkey is ostensibly a democracy, although not anymore under Erdogan, all of that stuff is still on the books.
You have to understand the three pillars of Ataturk's system, which were nationalism, secularism, and liberalism. Now, nationalism included a healthy respect for Islam as a core part of Turkish culture.
Exactly.
Nationalism also included a pan-Islamic Turkish movement that embraced the Kurds as fellow Turks in what seemed to be a welcoming and egalitarian system, while at the same time erasing Kurdishness.
Exactly.
And demanding that the Kurds agree to have their Kurdishness erased as their admittance to Turkishness.
Don't you just love the policy of assimilation?
And before he was Ataturk, he was Mustafa Kemal. He was a member of the Committee for Union and Progress, which is better known as the Young Turks. He was a military commander and government official under the three Pashas Young Turk government that dragged the Ottoman Empire into World War I. He was a military commander for the Ottoman Empire during World War I. And in this capacity, he was actively involved in ethnically cleansing Christians from Ottoman territory as part of a reaction against the Balkan Wars, which the Ottoman Empire was fighting World War I to reverse the peaceful settlement of.
And interestingly enough, folks, Ataturk was originally a North Macedonian. So, yeah.
But at the same, it doesn't matter. In the end, he was a great Turkish nationalist, which meant that he was a great Turkish chauvinist. The only difference between him and the more right-wing great Turkish chauvinists is he thought that everyone in Great Turkey could be a Turk if they wanted to. But he did consider Islam to be central to Turkishness. And by identifying the Kurds as Muslims, his government identified them as Turks rather than as Kurds, thus laying the groundwork for the Kurdish struggle and ultimately the Kurdish association with theories of national liberation and left-wing ideologies like Marxist-Leninism and social ecology.
Yeah.
And it's really, really important to understand that Erdogan is not so much anti-Ataturk as he is more pre-Ataturk and sort of supports a democratic dictatorship, for lack of better terms.
Yeah.
Controlled by a single political party based on the Islamic centralist Turkish nationalism of the pre-Ataturk CUP.
Yeah, definitely. That's a very Couldn't have said it better myself.
Now,
I mean, the Law and Justice Party, which is a far right party, and it's the worst of both worlds. It's fiscally conservative, fiscally neoliberal, socially very regressive, and so forth like that. I mean, if you see members of that party at an Erdogan rally, carrying posters of Ataturk, it's because they like Ataturk for the ultra nationalism, the socialism, and all that stuff, and the secularism, and
well, again, liberalism, not socialism. Let's all remember that Ataturk embraced capitalism and westernization as part of his secularism program.
But there was some socialism involved in that too. I got in my World Regional Studies book.
There was a lot of social democracy involved, as there always is in the best of post-World War II Cold War liberalism includes a lot of social democracy. But it's only possible because the worst of Cold War liberal democratic liberalism it was felt it necessary to disguise itself behind that social democratic veneer. And as the Cold War has made it irrelevant and obsolete, they have abandoned social democracy in favor of neoliberalism and the embrace of pre-Keynesian ideas about classical and neoclassical economics.
Exactly. And while I hate the term liberal left, I mean, there are some overlaps between socially liberals, economic liberals, and social democracy. I mean, that's why the Liberal Party of Canada, which, once upon a time, it did advance old school New Deal. In fact, it even went beyond the New Deal because they would have nationalized banks, nationalized railways, subsidized public transportations, and a much more generous welfare state than what the U.S. and even Britain had. But now, that faction of the Liberal Party is completely dead in the water, and it's all about, economic liberalism, neoliberalism, fiscal conservatism, you name it.
And of course, UK Labour has reached the point where, number one, bad news. Where was I? My brain just farted. I hate it when that
about the Labour Party.
Yes, the UK Labour Party. The bad news is that Ed Miliband is back, and the worst news is that Ed Miliband once again represents the Labour left.
Yeah. Yeah, to which I go like, But funnily enough, the Liberal Democrats of Britain, they are, I mean, forget their foreign policy. They are so pro-like imperialists and so forth. But the Liberal Democrats oftentimes are to the left of both Labour and Conservatives. So hence why sometimes you will hear this term liberal left.
Okay, so I will go ahead and give the best update I can on Rojava before we get to the real topic, which is the church. Though I think that some of the hooks here go in well, because with both Turkey and the church, we're ultimately talking about the Western imperialist order and how everything fits together. But as far as Rojava goes, at this point, the autonomous zone is still officially autonomous. The Kurds have made some sort of unity agreement with the ISIS guy who runs Syria now. Now, the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is the army that the Syrian Kurds had maintained to fight against ISIS and Assad, is now supposed to join the Syrian army. The good news is that if the Syrian Democratic Forces are joining the Syrian army, that means you've got a big chunk of the army that's not going to allow an attack on Rojava. So that's the good news. The bad news it means is that Rojava, in order to survive, is being forced to make deals with ISIS.
Make deals with the devil. Literally.
And the Syrian Democratic Forces, if everything goes according to plan, will be joining the official Syrian military structure as a part of their agreement with the new government to maintain their autonomy. And we will see what the ISIS rulers of Syria do in the area, what their state sponsors in Turkey, who we were talking about in connection with the Turkish Kurds laying down their arms, what they do next in the area, and how the new Syrian government fits into this whole structure of conflict against American imperialism based around resistance to Israeli genocide.
Well, right now the current far-right ISIS government, backed by Qatar, Turkey, Israel, the U.S., Britain, Canada, France, NATO, Germany, and so forth, is right now engaging in genocide of
They're attacking Alawite Muslim, Alawite Shiites, and various Syrian Christian minorities. Yes, which of course fits perfectly into the ISIS mainframe. You punish the Alawites because the Alawites are Assad's people, and you punish the Christians because they're not Muslims.
Assholes.
Hey, it's just like here in the U.S. where we punish Muslims because they're not Christians. And the people in the U.S. who want to punish Muslims for not being Christians love ISIS and don't care about Middle Eastern Christians one fucking bit.
That, by the way,
as you can, and this is our perfect segue. The perfect cut for this is the fact that the late Pope, who I have nothing good to say about outside the framework of his papacy itself, which still in the end is completely undercut by the fact he's the fucking Pope. He is the establishment. There's a huge limit to the good that the Pope can do because he's fucking the establishment. And you have to remember that in the end, no matter what good things you want to say about the Pope personally or what good influence the Catholic Church as an institution tries to have on the imperialist system, you have to remember in the end that ACAB, all cops are bastards, includes the fucking Pope more than anyone else.
Well, actually, look.
So on that note, the history of the Catholic Church in the Middle East is one of weird cooperation with the CIA. While at the same time pretending to be some sort of advocacy for human rights and minority rights and peace, not war, genocide is bad. And hey, it is great. It is great on the level of, damn it, if I were locked up in a church in Gaza knowing I was going to die, I would feel better if the Pope were calling me every night too. So on that note, yes, the Pope calling people in Gaza who is going to die after his short meeting with J.D. Vance. Yes, I mean, that's great that he was calling them in Gaza and trying to do that good for people who desperately needed it at that point in time. But ultimately, the Catholic Church is part of a system of institutions that sustains this whole notion of Western Empire good because Christian. I mean, is the Pope...
the more white you are, particularly the more...
Well, Christian is a code for white, as best influenced by the fact that I said before they don't fucking care about Middle Eastern Christians.
Yeah, no, it's crazy, and I just wanted to say as well. I also share your sentiments, and for me, I just like when it comes to Israel, I don't want to hear anybody's. I care about both sides. I don't care about anybody. Like, why can't we all get along? Unless you say and do the following BDS, I don't care like what good sentiments you have about like Palestinians, especially Palestinian Christians who are
so the minimum acceptable position on how this is all supposed to look in the end is the Hamas position. Now, that said, the Hamas position might surprise you because the Hamas state, which Israel doesn't want you to know this, exactly. But the Hamas state, such as it exists in Gaza, endorses a two-state solution that includes a return to pre-1963 borders.
Yeah.
And as long as that two-state solution includes a right of return for Palestinians who wish to return to their homeland, even if their homeland is in the state of Israel, and second, that said state of Israel has to be a secular democracy in which Palestinians enjoy equal rights. Now, the reason that I lay this out as the minimum acceptable position is because it is Hamas's position and the position of the small, tiny, infinitesimal, less than 1% of the Israeli electorate that agrees with the Hamas peace plan. This tiny group, less than 1% of the Israeli electorate, consists of Maki, the Israeli Communist Party, whose only parliamentarian was thrown out of the Knesset for opposing the Gaza genocide and being Jewish, which means the only Jewish member of the Knesset opposed to genocide was thrown out of the Knesset for opposing genocide. And there are no more members of the Knesset who oppose genocide as a result. That's number one. Number two, his party coalition, Hadash, is in coalition with the Arab nationalist and Arab social democratic parties in Israel, all of
That
which have the same position as Hamas as far as peace, a right of return and or reparation, combined with secular democracy in Israel with equal rights for all Israelis and official recognition of Palestinians as an Israeli ethnic minority. And I mention all of this because most people do not know that this is the position of Hamas and the quote unquote Israeli left allied with Hamas. But the thing that I mentioned that matters the most is this actual Israeli left allied with Hamas is less than 1% of the electorate. We're talking about fewer people than supported Jill Stein. And this is as a percentage of voters, not even total population. Fewer people as a percentage of voters than who supported Jill Stein for the U.S. for president in the U.S. Because remember, that was more than 2%. This is less than 1%.
And what you've just laid out, which is a good, I would say, path to the democratic secular one-state solution, which is what I endorse and what many people endorse. Mostly the Palestinian diaspora, and even those in the occupied territories, historic Palestine and whatnot, and those involved in Palestine solidarity. But what you just laid out is exactly why voices like Ilan Pappé, Gideon Levy, Amira Haas, Mika Peled, Max Blumenthal, all the other stuff aside, and others say the following: there is no changing Israel from within.
Yes.
International solidarity of BDS is the only way to stop what we're seeing happening right now in Gaza, West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the ongoing fuckery of settler colonialism, which Israel will continue.
And the need for international solidarity in the form of BDS, in my opinion, underscores the thing that I believe the Socialist Equality Party is right about, which is that we need a international revolution in solidarity against international capitalism.
Of course, yeah, definitely.
And that we cannot, in this modern system, as the plight of the Kurds has shown us, we cannot survive in the modern revolutionary world that exists in any sort of national struggle in one country model. We need some sort of model for international struggle. What that looks like, I'm still trying to figure out. I know it starts with mutual aid, community defense, coalition, solidarity coalitions, and builds from there. To our subject of the Catholic Church, Middle East peace, it's worth noting that the Catholic Church, despite all of its pro-Palestinian rhetoric in more recent years, the Catholic Church's official line has always been Zionist. That their advocacy of peace, while supporting aspirations for Palestinian collective self-determination, also acknowledges an Israeli state as a uniquely Zionist state in the Middle East and is not advocating for its replacement with a secular democratic state because it does not want to in any way hearken back to the good old days of the Crusades when the Catholic Church interfered more directly in Middle Eastern politics. Pope Leo the 14th wants us to think about Pope Leo the 13th, who, by the way, wrote an anti-communist encyclical about labor rights in Europe that says labor needs capital and capital needs labor, and that they're mutually dependent on each other and need to find some way to cooperate.
Boo.
Yes, exactly. This is who Leo the 14th is naming himself after explicitly, Leo the 13th.
Interesting.
That's what he says. Now, mind you, as a historian of the Catholic Church, when I hear Pope Leo, I think of Pope Leo X, who sold indulgences to rebuild the Vatican and fight a war against France and the Holy Roman Emperor, and who was so corrupt that a guy named Martin Luther hammered a set of demands to a church door. So, I mean, Leo the 14th may be intended to evoke Leo the 13th, but a lot of people who have studied history are going to hear Leo the 10th.
Yeah. Although, in defense, I'm actually going to go out on the limb and actually defend the Catholic Church. In defense of the Catholic Church, Martin Luther and the Protestants are even more right-wing and reactionary and violently anti-Semitic than even the Catholic Church. And that with the whole Protestant ethic,
and this is why I say neither Catholic nor Protestant, but Anabaptist.
But it's also a very interesting segue because because if you do study the Middle Ages, and you do study what feudalism is, and if you do even study all of the many reforms in response to corruption of the church, the Catholic Church, human rights abuses, the Crusades, which was an absolute clusterfuck in which Christianity and Western imperialism finally got a little bit of the bloody nose it deserved. When we talk about liberalism, I still remember this as if this was yesterday. I remember going into my history teacher, my IB history teacher, who was very left-leaning. Mr. Binns was his name. I remember going into the end of his comparative government class, the beginning of our class, looking at the white chalkboard, him explaining what a liberal democracy is, and it was the following: traditionalism, the free market, and something else which is not important to the topic. But anyways, I remember looking at that thinking, that's strange. When I think of liberalism, I think of more left-leaning people and stuff like that. So I asked Mr. Binns, I was like, wait a minute. For a liberal democracy, one of its key features is the free market. It's capitalism. I thought that's what a conservative democracy was. And Mr. Binns looked at me sheepishly going, Yuri, there's never been a conservative democracy. We've had a liberal democracy. And yes, part of a liberal democracy is the free market, capitalism, and stuff like that.
Traditionally speaking.
And it was right then and there, I realized, okay, I'm not just any kind of a leftist. I'm not just any kind of a socialist. I'm pretty much like a Marxist and so forth. And that's what led me in the rabbit hole that is Marxism and later, not subscribing to anti-communist leftists.
When it comes to traditional political thought, conservatives are against liberal democracy and are for the monarchy. Now, in the modern sense, the modern anarcho-capitalist is just crowning himself a king of a smaller empire. We're seeing this re-balkanization where all these corporate powers want to crown themselves king and remove the state from the equation. And so we're seeing, the conservative right is just, they're pro-monarchist.
And I remember when I first interviewed a communist, and he still is a dear friend of mine, Jay Watts, former central organizer of the Communist Party of Canada. But I told him what I just told you, and my follow-up question was, I'm curious your response. And he's like, well, I think he's being very honest. And yes, part of a liberal democracy is private property. And
The three
this is
principles.
and then he said that you cannot have libertarianism. Libertarianism is just extreme liberalism, but you cannot. But libertarianism doesn't work because it needs the state to protect its private property and to keep, you know, the uppity working class in line and whatnot.
Well, because and when you break down anarcho-capitalism, oh my gosh, when you break down anarcho-capitalism, what they are actually advocating for is not the abolition of the state in the sense that there will be no more state power. There will be no more use of coercive force in the way that anarcho-capitalists define the state. What they mean is that the liberal state, the nation state, will cease to exist, and the political state will return to the ownership, the politics of ownership as political power, monarchy/feudalism. And this is just the political right openly saying, yeah, we're not Republican, we're monarchist in a new and different way.
Yeah.
And now, the Pope is the oldest and most continuously sitting monarch on the fucking planet.
And then not only that, where we get into pretty funny territory when it comes to the Vatican, which folks may not know this, but Vatican City is a city-state. Ostensibly, it's supposed to be completely independent from Italy, but it is its own city-state, which has a seat at the UN. It is an observing member state when we talk about the European Union and stuff like that. So, never ever underestimate just how powerful the Vatican itself is, which is why
this means the Pope is a head of state with the ability to address the United Nations at the same level of seriousness as the leader of any other international government, if he truly wants to use it.
This is why it is a big deal when the Pope visits a country, when he does speak to the U.S. Congress, and when Pope Francis was dragged, not of his own voluntarily, but he was dragged by Indigenous people and Indigenous solidarity folks in Canada to apologize for the Catholic Church's crimes against humanity. All churches, by the way, were complicit in residential school and genocide and whatnot. But when the Pope was literally dragged into Canada to address survivors and descendants, that is because motherfucker's got a lot of power with his, fake city-state known as Vatican City and whatnot.
And let's not forget that generations of pandering politicians in both the U.S. and Canada have given the Catholic Church way too much say in the educational systems of places like Quebec and Louisiana and so on. There's a reason for anti-clericalism in Mexico and why they were killing priests and burning down monasteries and nunneries in Spain. It's like, no. The nuns may have been innocent, holy people sitting in the abbey praying, but they were also the landlords whose armed thugs were killing peasants for not paying enough rent.
Yeah. And it is true. Of course, I would never, push back against my own thesis, which is to say that the Catholic Church has been a reactionary force in world affairs would be an understatement. All that being said, when we talk about Pope Francis, who I disagree a little bit with my good friend Chris about his legacy, but when people talk about how much they appreciate Pope Francis's different rhetorics, Pope Francis being somewhat more socially tolerant, addressing the issue of climate change, and wanting and speaking out against capitalism and whatnot.
And all of that is good. And
Yeah.
I'm not gonna say that it's not great that Francis did all this stuff while he was Pope.
Yeah.
But the legacy of Francis, in my opinion, is that he was a good little soldier for the Catholic Church all his life, and that's how he became Pope.
Of course, yeah.
When we say ACAB includes the Pope, I also want to say ACAB includes the Jesuits, who are cops for the Catholic Church. And, both and Francis was a Jesuit. And in his capacity as a Jesuit, he narked on liberation theologists in the Argentinian church to the Argentinian state during the most dangerous part of the Dirty War, thus making him personally complicit in the killing of his fellow Catholics.
Yeah, but I would also say, and I think as somebody like Pope Francis, who I think really does believe in heaven and hell, redemption, purgatory, and so forth, I personally believe, although he's not alive for me to interview him unless any of his close advisors want to come on 1+1. But I personally believe that he was racked with guilt for his complicity.
Of course he was.
And so forth. Wait, but let me finish. I personally believe that he was racked with guilt and so forth. And ergo, when he became Pope, that's why he sounds a lot like a liberation theologist, or those members of the Catholic Church who do believe in social justice, climate justice, and
do I believe that Pope Francis was a good man who was racked by guilt for the bad things that he had to do in order to play ball to be in the position to one day become Pope? Yes, I absolutely do. I absolutely believe the best of Pope Francis on a personal, individual level. And I absolutely couldn't give a fuck. And the reason for that is because everything he did on a personal and individual level ultimately served to make people feel that much more comfortable with the institution of the Catholic Church and the influence that it exerts in the Western imperialist system. And what we're talking about, even within the church, when we talk about this kind of liberalism, what we're talking about for Vatican II is a way to make the imperialism of the soul more humane and acceptable to the people whose soul is in the iron fist of empire.
And that's great segue. And Vatican, I have to say, Pope Francis, no question of a doubt, was the most popular pope since, let me get the name out, since Pope John. Since Pope John, I cannot read Roman numericals.
So John the 23rd.
Who advanced Vatican II. And
John the 23rd was the guy who started Vatican II, yes. Called for it, said we need it, said the church has to have a theology and law and doctrine that encompasses the modern world in which it exists, even if we are going to continue to be anti-modernist.
Yeah.
And
what we see now with the Catholic Church. So, for example, Pope John Paul II, who is an evil, miserable, far-right SOB of Opus Dei and so forth, when you see him engaging with other Christian sects, when you see him engaging with Muslims, with the Muslim community, when you see him engaging with the Jewish community, that's all part of Vatican II. When some of the worst punitive elements of becoming a member, in other words, becoming a nun or so forth, Vatican II got rid of a lot of that. Although interesting enough, the fact that so many did not even want to join the Catholic Church because of losing the perks of being, an asshole more or less, says a lot about some of the people who want to join, churches and whatnot.
Well, you should really try to sort of check out Catholic Twitter and hear discussions of American Catholics about people who convert to Catholicism. Converts to Catholicism from other Christian denominations are not seen well by liberal American Catholics. All the J.D. Vance killed the Pope sort of jokes are very, very serious and nasty when told by liberal American Catholics. There is a dislike for certain kinds of converts to Catholicism by those liberal American Catholics.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, and the non-binary who are watching this or who are going to be watching this in the future, it's also very important to note, if y'all think that the Catholic Church is conservative, and it is conservative and socially regressive, I don't even like to use the term socially conservative.
Reactionary is the word for the Catholic Church. Reactionary.
But if people think that the Catholic Church is too right-wing for their liking, there are far-right Catholics at this very moment who are flaming anti-Semites like Mel Gibson, his father, and his grandfather, who thought that the church, when they passed back into, were a bunch of heretics.
So let's remember that there is a group of bishops in England. I can't remember what they call their branch of the Catholic Church. They were actually schismatic. They said that John Paul II, of all people, was too liberal and wishy-washy and pro-queer and pro-Jewish and pro-Muslim and pro-colonized person and pro-abortion, and that they were leaving the Catholic Church because Pope John Paul II was too liberal, and it was like being a communist.
And funnily enough, and also going back to how Protestantism is not like a liberal alternative to the Catholic Church. What was that guy's name? Ian Paisley Sr., very sectarian, Northern Irish, pro-unionist, very anti-Irish Catholic. When Pope John Paul II went to speak at the European Union's Parliament, he was heckling him and calling him the Antichrist and whatnot.
Yes.
So.
But let's talk about this again, because this goes back to what the words liberal and conservative actually mean. So
liberals are compassionate conservatives who have better table manners. Conservatives are
Protestantism, in its embrace of private property over the notion that God should own everything. Protestantism is fundamentally liberal. Now, not just liberal, not just economically, but in the sense of ideology. So it's very important to understand that the idea of freedom of religion, in its modern sense, and I'm calling you out because you live in this part of the world now. The idea of freedom of religion in its most modern sense was not thought up by universalist Christians who thought everybody had a point. It was thought up by die-hard Calvinist, Republican, Dutch people who were willing to murder each other over their personal political differences when it came to their and religious differences when it came to their internal politics, but did not believe that the religion of the guy in charge of the town should affect the religious practice of the people who lived in the town. primarily because they didn't want Catholic landlords to be able to oppress them.
Yeah,
so,
and Calvinists are even more like.
Well, and that's the thing. It is the most conservative Protestants, in the sense of how we consider liberal versus conservatism today. It is the most conservative Protestants who came up with the core tenets of liberalism, because liberalism is not about this sort of left-right arbitrary dynamic that we draw in modern media, but liberalism is an argument between republicanism, which is to say secular representative democracy with its power ultimately held by the dictatorship of capital, over the world in which God and the king own everything. Now, the anti-liberalism of much of European Protestantism comes with the necessity of people like Luther and Calvin having to make compromises with political power, saying, well, ultimately, if you're going to have someone make the decision about religion in a country, ultimately it has to be based on the characteristics of that country. So, the ultimate religious decisions in a country should be made by that country's government, and in most places that meant a king. And then the whole idea of freedom of religion evolved around, well, what if the king then represses the religions he doesn't like? So you have all these ideological positions that Protestants occupied out of opportunistic necessity, because it did not violate their deeper theory and therefore was an acceptable compromise. Because you have to understand that Protestant theory is totally different from socialist theory. So, Protestantism is central to liberalism in the sense of liberalism as the Enlightenment-ism that separates the modern capitalist world from the pre-modern world of kings and various kinds of feudalism.
Yeah. In fact, and also it's important to address this. You often hear this expression amongst the Liberal Party of Canada. You always hear this amongst the Labour Party of England, and to a degree the Liberal Democrats, that they are a broad church. So let me talk about a faction of the broad church of Catholicism. This is where you get the good. This is where you get your good leftists to a degree, and that is liberation theology. But also, even before liberation theology, which was left-leaning Catholic priests and nuns and so forth speaking out against the fascists and the far-right dictators.
We're talking about social theology in the U.S., Catholic Worker magazine, the best of Christian socialism, which is a tradition that was aggressively advocated by many American Catholics in the early 20th century, that the Christian world by necessity needed to be socialist rather than liberal or conservative, because God is love. Fuck you.
And this is where you had members of the Catholic Church of that left faction who were involved in the civil rights movement, who were involved in, to a degree, women's liberation. They were certainly social justice warriors, and to a degree, racial justice warriors. And this is where you had people like Father Berrigan, who would speak out against the Vietnam War, would burn draft cards, would hide draft dodgers and people who burnt their draft cards. I'm completely blanking out on the nun, who was also quite a lefty of her time. But that's where you get a lot of really good left-leaning Catholics.
A Catholic university a Catholic university just outside of New Orleans is named after a priest who did immense things for civil rights in the post-Reconstruction South. It's unbelievable. That Xavier University, which is a black Catholic school outside New Orleans that was specifically founded for black students who were shut out of the state university system by segregation.
Interesting.
So you've got this social justice theology that's very strong in U.S. Catholicism. That is the basis for what we would call Christian socialism. But this Christian socialism is also represents a lot of the right wingers who bash abortion and women and queer people, who Chris Hedges sort of laments that can no longer be part of our movement the way they were part of the anti-Vietnam War movement in the 60s.
Oh,
and
by
it's
the way,
well, these issues matter more because people are being attacked for their identities more explicitly.
Oh, the nun whose name I was blanking out, Dorothy Day.
Yes.
Yeah, so. And then, but also it's important to note, as you've mentioned, so Oscar Romero, fantastic priest who spoke out against the El Salvador fascist military dictatorship. I even have a collection of his speeches, sermons he would say. Now, while he was great when it came to social, economic, dare I even say racial, and to a degree, gender justice, he does talk about how he's against abortion.
He talks about he was prior to his embrace of liberation theology. Oscar Romero represented the right wing of the most socially conservative faction of the church in El Salvador. He was he was not in any way associated with communism or even liberalism. He was considered a hard right leader who represented the most conservative elements of the church. And then he started seeing the government kill his parishioners, and he had serious changes of outlook on the way he saw the world. And while he never gave the sort of "I was wrong" pro-queer speech that Castro gave at a later point in his life, there is a transition in his sermons where he stops talking about his opposition to abortion and perversion and starts talking all the time without ever stopping about the government killing his parishioners.
Yeah, and also Sister Helen Mary Prejean. I'm sorry if
Helen Marie Prejean, yes. Speaking of Louisiana.
Yes, in fact, folks might know her as a very well-known anti-death penalty advocate.
And pro-prisoner advocate in general, too, as well. Very specifically anti-death penalty, but also pro-prisoner in general.
And also, and she is on record as being, anti-abortion and so forth.
She's a Catholic. She's a nun, a Catholic nun, because of the position of the church. Unless the Pope actually changes doctrine, or a council of bishops actually changes doctrine, a Catholic nun has to be anti-abortion. Now they can have.
But who was the one Catholic priest who actually got excommunicated because he was for women becoming priests? He would always protest against the School of Americas and whatnot, where America trains all of the fascists of Latin America to do what they do in that region of the world. But I'm also blanking on his name.
I can't remember his name either. I think I know who you mean. He's another one of those Catholic worker Christian socialist guys.
Yeah, I'll try to find it while you say something.
So ultimately, what you've got to remember is that the late Pope Francis represents the faction of the Catholic Church.
I got very quickly, Father Roy Bourgeois. School of the Americas watch.
Bourgeois. That's hilarious.
Yeah, it is hilarious. Bourgeois or bourgeoisie, but yes, that is his last name. However you want to.
I just can't say it. That's hilarious. But the late Pope Francis represents the people in the church in Latin America who let Oscar Romero get killed. So we have to. That's a big part of his legacy in an institutional and structural and historically contextual sense, possibly more so than the good things he did and said as Pope.
You really think that?
I mean, the Cold War is the Cold War. The fact that, we talk about the Dirty War and the way that it repressed any sort of progressivism in the majority of Latin American countries during the Cold War. The late president of Uruguay, Jose Mujica, who spent years in prison because of the Dirty War, just died. And he said in one of the last things he wrote, which was published by, of all unfortunate sources, Jacobin in America after his death, he said, the people of my generation made a mistake in thinking that if we just made it about a class war and nothing else, that ultimately we would inevitably win. And what we didn't really think about was that we had to build a new culture against capitalism.
Yeah.
And so, so it's this understanding by this old line Marxist that, yes, we need to fight a class war, but this class war needs to be informed by the understanding that culture is a ruling class weapon.
But fun facts, though, and again, this is me a little bit defending the Catholic Church. Fun fact is, in Brazil, the new right, which is really just the old right rebranded, the fascists there, actually isn't coming from the Catholic Church, but is being exported by Christian evangelicals, the Christian Zionist movement. Steve Bannon himself exported all that into the Bolsonaro movement.
Brazil is such a wonderful bundle of contradictions in its history.
Of course. It's one of the most
Brazil,
Colombia, Chile, and Peru. It's one of the most American parts of Latin America.
Well,
Mexico as well. Although under the wonderful Claudia Sheinbaum and AMLO before, it's sort of pivoting in a good lefty direction.
Brazil is one of the only countries in the world that had actively liberal monarchs who chose to set up liberal systems that did not need them to do more than provide publicly choreographed ceremonial roles in the liberal system. And yet, when the Brazilian monarchy was replaced by a republican system, the republican system became reactionary and anti-liberal and sold out to northern capitalists at the complete expense of its own people. And Brazil rapidly went from being a monarchy, but one of the most liberal countries in the world compared to, say, Spain or Russia or even France sometimes, to being an economic colony of the United States run by military officers who didn't believe in anything. And this was with the fall of the monarchy and its replacement by a republic, because the leaders of the Republic only had their own class interests at heart, whereas for whatever reason, the emperors of Brazil believed their class interests were best served by liberal reformism.
Interesting.
And they built up a Brazil that was considered more respected internationally than the United States. If you had asked the British and the French and the Germans of 1864 whether the United States or Brazil was going to be the next world power, they would have told you it was going to be Brazil. And it's just absolutely hilarious how the replacement of one leader committed to this ideological program, even this weak sauce liberalism that it was, weak sauce liberal nationalism with imperial characteristics, because he still called himself emperor, remember. This guy was replaced with a so-called Republican government that sold the people's interests out to northern capitalists to enrich themselves and create and create a better society for the Brazilian bourgeois with a snap of their fingers at the expense of everybody else.
Yeah. And funnily enough, and people may ask why the contradictions that exists in Christianity. Well, I mean, if you even try reading Saint Augustine, you're going to see lots of contradictions within just a sentence or a paragraph.
I'm glad you mentioned Augustine, because Saint Augustine is fundamental to the Catholic Education Project, both the official Catholic Education Project of the organized Catholic Church and the unofficial Catholic Educational Project funded by wealthy conservative Catholics in the U.S.
Yeah.
And helped by their bishop allies.
Because what is interesting about Christianity, dare I even say Islam, but let's just focus on Christianity, is while there's lots of horrific stuff in whatever Bible you read, whether it's the King James Bible, the book of Leviticus, the book of Leviathan, book of Job, and so forth like that. While there's lots of gendercide, lots of slavery, lots of genocide, and stuff like that. When you are reading Jesus's words and stuff like that, I think the Mount Sermon is way more interesting and way more important than the Ten Commandments. Because
only the Christians would agree with you.
The Beatitudes are Jesus. Off the top of my head are the following: blessed are the meek, blessed are the merciful, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are those that weep. And this is where the problem starts.
This is where the problem starts. Because when we say blessed are the meek, what the fuck do we mean? No, I'm serious when I'm asking this. What do we mean when we say that? Now, what Jesus said, if we are supposed to try to take the whole Sermon in the Mount in its original context as best we can, based on intratextual clues, what Jesus is saying when he's saying blessed are the meek, and this is also, mind you, where Karl Marx was saying religion is the opiate of the masses. What Jesus is saying when he says blessed are the meek, and even more when he says blessed are those who suffer for righteousness' sake, is that blessed are those who get fucked in this life because they will have treasures in heaven.
Yeah.
Now, when Jesus says Blessed are those who get fucked in this life, because they shall have treasures in heaven. There is a portion of modern believers, and this is where the problem kicks in, the portion of modern believers who then say, all right, well, if everybody who deserves him is going to have treasures in heaven, no reason to help him here. If we help them here, we might actually take away some of their treasures in heaven, and that would be bad.
Although, again, defending the church, although I would say I would counter that by saying Jesus did also say that it was next to impossible for a rich person to get into heaven.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did.
Just saying.
And this is why context matters. And this is why I say neither Catholic nor Protestant, but Anabaptist. But so what you have to remember that in this whole Jesus talk, when we talk about Jesus, we talk about Jesus as represented in the Bible that was chosen by a bunch of pre-Catholic Christian bishops who were deathly afraid that the Emperor Constantine would cut their heads off if they pissed him off. And that the person who most benefits at the time that the Latin Bible is codified in its sort of first primitive form and distributed among the believers, the biggest beneficiary of the idea of blessed are the meek and blessed are those who suffer for righteousness' sake is the fucking Roman emperor who's responsible for all the fucking suffering.
Well, and also, and this is where I'm not attacking the Catholic Church, but I am attacking the Protestants. But this
is where I'm attacking the whole idea of the church.
Yeah.
Because in its very first official formation,
but like the whole idea of personal responsibility, and that you can't just go into a booth, confess your sins, and then and then you'll be absolved until the next time you sin, and then you keep correcting yourself. But the whole idea of like personal responsibility is that you always gotta be on your toes. Don't think that just because you are meek, don't think that just because you are suffering that you're going to that you're going to go into the kingdom of heaven.
Well, but that's the whole thing, and then you get to the next worst part of Protestantism, which is the idea of predestination, which ends up actually working at direct cross purposes to the idea of treasures in the next world. But that's a whole other show. That's for the show about Protestantism. This is the show about Catholicism.
Yeah.
And in the context of Catholicism, monarchy, Protestantism, republic, and sort of idea liberal constitutional freedoms, then Catholic Church equals conservative, Protestant Church equals liberal. We believe conservative and liberal are both wrong. That is why we are socialists.
But for anyone, though, who is a left-wing Christian, and I don't even think that's an oxymoron, although...
I'm not saying that... I want to say once again, I'm not saying that people shouldn't be faithful.
Yeah.
I am not equating... Religion, in my opinion, is not the problem. The church is the problem.
Yeah.
The church is not a religious institution. The church is a state institution that from its very beginning had to conform to the fact that the emperor would cut their heads off if he didn't like what they were saying. Now, the emperor might not want to cut their heads off. He might be a nice guy who publicly makes Christian noises and who's baptized on his deathbed. But at the point where they're having the council to decide exactly what the Beatitudes actually mean, in the version of the Bible we're actually going to distribute to the faithful, the foremost thing on their mind was, yeah, we're going to tell Christians to be meek because we don't want Emperor Constantine to cut our head off.
Mm-hmm. But I also just want to say, for anyone that is a left-wing Catholic or a left-wing Mormon, left-wing evangelical, or a Quaker, or a Unitarian, and if I was a religious person, I probably would be a member of the Unitarian Church or the Quakers. There is a magazine which is dedicated to social justice, and it's led by left-wing factions of all Christian
living
faiths,
in Belgium.
That is Sojourners, which is named after the Methodist black abolitionist, feminist, whatnot, Sojourner Truth.
Yes.
Folks should check that out. And Jim Rice, who's the current editor, is an evangelical Christian.
Yes.
But he's of the very small left-wing faction.
Living where you live, I would strongly recommend, even though I reject the pacifism. Living where you live, I would strongly recommend researching Menno Simons.
Menno
Simons.
Is he a Mennonite?
Yes, Mennonite comes from Menno Simons.
Folks,
I am less.
For folks who don't know, Chris, his cultural background is Mennonite, but
yes,
but you're not practicing Mennonite, right?
I mean, define practicing. I mean,
actually believe in Christian, actually I believe in Christianity, going to church.
So here's what. So if we're going to talk about what I believe in a religious sense, then I'm going to get crazy on you, and then I'm going to say what I think that craziness translates to in the real world in a practical and pragmatic sense, because you can't build any pragmatic theory on craziness. You're asking me what I believe. Okay, what I believe is that we are constantly beset by the conditions that Christ described when he was talking about what the apocalypse would be like. We are constantly living under apocalyptic conditions. When it comes to the way that things can change, and a lot of political stability in the post-imperialist era has cushioned people from this, and people forgot it. But in the sense of how quickly things can change and how quickly one institution can be replaced by another, the world is constantly ending.
Yeah.
If you want to talk about the book of Revelation in its most literal, historically contextual sense, they're talking about the fact that there was a great deal of religious and political turmoil in the entire Roman Empire because of the specific religious and political reforms being enacted by the Emperor Domitian at the time that the book that we call the Apocalypse of St. John was written. So all that crap, all the world is going to end tomorrow crap aside, they were talking about something really close to the world ending in their own real time when they wrote the book of Revelation. The world is always ending. And because the world is always ending, we should conduct our lives as if we were living in the end times every day of our life. Now, that is what I believe in a religious sense. Now, what this comes from in a theological basis is from a guy named Melchior Hoffman, who said that the conditions of Germany during the Wars of Reformation could only be called apocalyptic, and the Wars of Reformation represented the end of one world and the birth of a new world. And therefore, we should understand that the apocalypse is happening now and not at some imaginary future date that we can push aside.
Interesting.
So that's the religious basis for Anabaptism, ultimately. The first expression of Anabaptism as a political and religious phenomenon was in the city of Munster in Germany, where militant Anabaptists throughout the municipal and clerical governments of the city replaced them with trusted members of the church elected by other members of the church, and essentially established a dictatorship of the proletariat, or though it was more, in the sense of the time, it was more a dictatorship of the petty bourgeois, but in the sense that the petty bourgeois was the most progressive force against the monarchy and the church.
Interesting.
Now, you have to understand that if you are a classical Marxist, then the acceptance of the petty bourgeois of the Enlightenment period as the revolutionary class, and if this liberalism is better than conservatism evolution, is absolutely progressive every time. Even if what came from it is regressive now, it was absolutely progressive then. That is the classical Marxist interpretation of social and economic progress. So that capitalism is progressive and modern when scientifically compared with feudalism and monarchy.
That's
simply because it broadens the class of people who benefit. But while still, it's still reliant on somebody being exploited for that class to benefit. And Marx's whole idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat can best be summed up as an effective state government that polices capitalists in the interest of the working class, separate from the concerns of capitalism, and instead focus on the material concerns of the working class and those sections of society dependent on them. Yeah. Now we can argue against whether historical dialecticism, in the sense that Marx believed in it, is really useful anymore or not. But the process of dialectical reasoning to resolve contradictions and the political reality of seeing ourselves as representing specific class interests are fundamental to revolutionary thought. And therefore, Marx is at least right about himself in that he's more progressive than what came before him.
Well, when we talk about the Catholic Church, I'm just going to say this: Pope Francis was Pope Francis was the best one. Then comes the one that introduced Vatican II. But the best Pope that we never had, and he should be he should be Pope. He also should be. He is the rightful president of Haiti. Is Jean-Bertrand Aristide, who was a liberation theologist, and the goddamn Vatican was part of the coalition of the willing that overthrew that wonderful socialist.
I believe he is dead. I believe the guy I'm thinking about is dead now. But the Pope that we never had, but most should have, is ultimately the symbol for what is wrong with the Catholic Church in a very involuntary way. I need to look up his name later on because it's something that's worthy of research now, and I really need to find out if I'm right that he's dead, because I say a prayer for him if he is. But the man who should have been Pope and wasn't, in the sense of justice, and if there really were any sort of redemption possible for the Catholic Church, would be the priest who stood up for the people who were reporting clerical abuse of minors within the church, and who was ultimately defrocked and suspended from practicing as a priest because he continually used his position to investigate charges against priests for sexual misconduct. Pope John Paul II suspended him, said you can't do priest shit anymore over this. Benedict XVI, who was the man who John Paul II put in charge of covering up the scandal, became the next pope after being the man who told this guy he couldn't be a priest anymore.
Well, interesting enough,
that's the man who should have succeeded John Paul II and not Benedict XVI.
Well, of course, who continued the abuse that Pope John Paul II knew very well about.
And let's remember who.
But listen, interestingly enough, I did a Google search, Catholic priest whistleblowers. There is a website called CatholicWhistleblowers.com.
Yes,
which is dedicated to that. On November. Well, anyways, I think the person you're looking for, his name is Phil Saviano, and he did pass away at the age of 69. 69. He was a key clergy sex abuse whistleblower. That's how they describe him. PBS.
The guy I'm thinking of when he first began to report people was in some senior position in the military Catholic, the U.S. military Catholic chaplainate, and was receiving reports of abuse from priests who were responsible for congregations that had the wives and kids of service members. And he was fielding reports from service members' kids that priests were abusing them. And he did everything he could to investigate this. And he was fired from his position in the Catholic chaplainate, not on the U.S. military side, but on the Catholic side, Catholic Church side, was reassigned somewhere else by the Catholic Church, and immediately ended up both continuing the previous work he was doing despite the change in his position, and fielding new accusations from kids in the new system in which he was working, and pursuing them as well. And they punished him for that.
But then, are you of the opinion, since it's funny how it's very easy to overturn, roll back, or abolish left institutions, whether it's a newspaper, whether it's a magazine, whether it's a political party, or whether it's actual policy. You can't do that for some reason in institutionally right-wing institutions like the army, the police. So are you of the opinion, because there are two minds about this, there are some who think, yeah, you can make the Catholic Church into a left-wing institution, and others who say, no, it was founded to be the right-wing institution that it is. It's going to die on that. Ergo, all you can really hope for is one step, two step forwards, and if the next pope comes along, that it's not three step backwards.
Well, well, that's the whole nature of institutions. The whole purpose of institutions is to serve as a natural authoritarian break on any sort of progressive change for the better. The purpose of institutions in a liberal democracy are to preserve the ideals and interests of those who benefit from liberal democracy.
And that's why my message to all of you students who are protesting your overpriced, predatory lending universities is drop out and
Well,
don't
I
worry.
mean,
You can be a great journalist, a great historian, a great people power man like my dear friend Eve Angler, who's a frequent champion on 1+1.
I am not a college graduate. I am a guy with a high school diploma. Depending on how you want to characterize me, the way I got my high school diploma, you can call me a high school dropout. Though that is not strictly accurate, I did officially graduate and do officially have a diploma.
That's fascinating. And look, dude, and you're much better. In fact, I think you will learn much more by just going on Eclectic Radical. Folks, do subscribe and do donate generously. You will learn much more interesting history from a left-wing perspective than any of your overpriced universities. No offense, though, to Dr. Cornel West, Professor Noam Chomsky, the late Howard Zinn.
So let's remember that of the three you mentioned, only Howard Zinn actually taught history. Noam Chomsky is a linguist.
Yeah.
And
although Dr. Cornel West did,
Cornel West is a theologian. He is very specifically, his current faculty position is very specifically at a seminary. His job is to shape the minds of future ministers within his ecumenical standpoint, which is why, in my opinion, it is worrisome that in his educational activity, he associates with some of the worst Christian school charter grifters in both the Protestant and Catholic establishments. We should not forget this, nor should we forget that his feckless, selfish, opportunistic campaign for the presidency in 2024 served no one but himself.
I do have to admit, as somebody who, I still admire Dr. Cornel West, but I do have to admit, as somebody who once really, really admired Dr. Cornel West compared to now, and thought of him as sort of like, Bob Marley.
It looks like we are having an internet issue with Yuri again.
Campaign. So I did not like how that campaign went. And, anyone who watches 1+1, and I'm sure anyone who watches your show, I've had Renee Johnston.
Renee Johnston.
Program Saturdays with Renee's Black Liberation Media with my good friend Dr. Jared Ball. She can give you some very, very good left-wing criticism as well as just tactical criticisms of everything that was wrong with Dr. Cornel West's bid for the presidency.
And a lot of the Cop City stuff being circulated by people associated with the PSL right now is based on the excellent work that Renee Johnston did on her Substack about Cop City couple years ago now, since the last time she was on my show to talk about it.
But funnily enough, this is actually funnily enough, and if you want to change the subject, let me know if you want to change the subject. But the black churches, which are an interesting can of worms in and of itself, these are places where you will find lots of great justices at the same time being the multiple personality disorders that so many people of faith do have. Also, lots of socially regressive nonsense and so forth like that. This is where you get the queer phobia, the transphobia, the patriarchy, and a lot of the fire and brimstone, tough on crime, to law and order sort of stuff. And
so I don't want to comment too much on the Black church because I come from a church so white it has its own ethnic group associated with it. I mean, that's just the way it is. I come from a church so white it has its own ethnic group associated with it, and all those people are white folks who live on farms in Germany and speak a dialect of German almost as often as they speak English. And my great-grandparents on my mother's side, both sides of her family, lived that way and chose, because of a modern daughter who had modern ideas, chose to move to the West Coast and sort of join the modern world in a very open-hearted sort of way. And all of the post-World War II Mennonites who joined that modern world in that open way have been much like any other white Christians. There's good and there's bad, and the best Mennonite groups, and I'm always very proud of this, the best Mennonite groups have always embraced pro-queer and pro-women politics. There are a lot of women ministers in the Mennonite establishment now.
Interesting.
The Mennonite church merged with its progressive split away church when the conservatives when the conservatives who had prevented the church from becoming progressive seceded from the church anyway. The rump church went and joined the progressive church instead of continuing on its own, and I've always found that admirable.
So I will just say this though about the various Black churches, and I would say it's the same thing with the ones in Africa, the ones in Haiti, the ones everywhere where there is a Black community. They do a lot, yeah, as you say, they do a lot of good, but there's also a lot of bad. And I think Diallo Kenyatta would definitely agree with me that sometimes when Black folk get very radicalized and are ready to advance a great social, racial, gender, eco-justice movement, it is often those very churches that decap the movement.
And here's where the problem is that post-Munster, because let's remember, Munster is where violent Anabaptists seized the local and church government and took over and basically put people their churches trusted in positions of responsibility. They went around and asked the working people, do you like your boss? If they said no, they said, where do you want to work? And they took them to wherever they wanted to work out of the workplace they were in. They went around to all the married women and they asked them if they liked their husbands. If they said no, they didn't like their husbands, they asked them, well, who do you want to live with? And they took them to live with whoever they wanted to live with, even if that person was already married to someone else. And for this, they were slandered as being pro-polygamy by slandered as being pro-polygamy by both Calvinists and Catholics, murdered by the Calvinists, driven out of Germany and into Switzerland and Holland. And the people who followed them, Conrad Grebel in Switzerland and Menno Simons in Holland, were annoying pacifists who didn't believe in participating in local politics because that was worldly, and you should just focus on living a godly life. and became reactionary in their rejection of the reactionary world instead of trying to revolutionize it.
Well, let me add something going back to our good friends the Catholics. I've interviewed 3 times, and they are all brilliant interviews on Irish history and the Republic of Ireland post independence. I interviewed the now retired General Secretary of the Communist Party of Ireland, Eugene McCartan, who is still involved with lots of left wing activism, and the Socialist Voice or the People's Voice, which is the publication about the black churches, saying that
And it looks like we're having some technical difficulties again. I appreciate Yuri being with us despite them. Again, me personally, church so white, own ethnic group, got to be careful about what I say about black churches. It's not my place to talk about the specific issues of the black church in the United States. The United States, the church in America tends to support the state in America because of the symbols of our civic religion. And our civic religion is vocally Christian. It tends to be more white Christian than black Christian. But, the success of Raphael Warnock as a liberal in the very revolutionary church of Martin Luther King Jr. sort of establishes that a liberal church is a liberal church, regardless of its racial component. And what really matters is that the only way that religion can stay revolutionary is to not associate itself in the long term with, quote, the church, which is generally a de facto arm of the state, whatever church we're talking about. Yuri, are you still there, or are you broken up again? I know you just got back.
Sorry about that. Internet's being a jerkwad. Anyways, what I was going to say about Eugene McCartan of the Communist Party of Ireland is he said a version of what I said about the black churches, which is even though the Catholic Church is an integral part of the Irish identity and Irish culture, and there's lots of good social justice that came out of it, there's also the dark side of it, which is the social regressivism, the Catholic Church of Ireland being involved in the slave labor and the slut shaming of the Mary Magdalene Muslims, the queer phobia and stuff like that, and also supporting 2 to 3 right-wing parties, which are Christian, Democrat,
well, the extreme conservative Fine Gael party has always paid lip service to being the traditionalist Catholic party, though it's not really true. They're more Irish nationalist than traditionalist Catholic, but they've always paid a great deal of lip service to traditional Catholicism.
But both Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are ghastly right-wing parties involved in numerous crimes against humanity to their own Irish people, the Irish working class, and Irish women, notoriously the Mary Magdalene Muslims,
and it's worth noting that the great Irish revolutionary Wolfe Tone was a Protestant.
Oh, was he?
Yes, Wolfe Tone was a Protestant.
And here is me thinking you were going to say James Connolly, who the Communist Party of Ireland really lionized.
Connolly was anti-clericalist, was he not? He was he was a traditional communist. In his religion is the opiate of the masses. Get that priest out of my government.
Which is why I've been to Ireland once, Dublin specifically, for just a weekend, and I took some souvenirs, and one of the postcards is of the Irish Constitution, and it has some of the famous names. James Connolly is one of them, but you won't hear him being too much acknowledged in mainstream Irish.
Well, it's like, you know why,
unless you're on like the far left, like the
you know why Benito Juarez was a hero to poor Mexicans and a villain to rich Mexicans and to Europeans?
The anti-clericalism.
Benito Juarez was an anti-clericalism who abolished monasteries and nunneries and made the priests go out and actually work if they wanted to have an income, and made the church pay for them instead of the state, and cut off their access to public education and cut off their access to automatic political influence and automatic membership in certain government bodies. And that's why they kept trying to overthrow him.
Now, Chris, I got asked this. This is a surprise I'm going to do with you. But I got to ask you this. How many episodes have you been doing of the Eclectic Radical?
So counting extra promo videos, this is number 196 for the number of videos I have uploaded to YouTube.
196 episodes, because I am going to be far too busy the next several weeks. I won't get the chance to personally invite both of you, and he was supposed to be my co-panelist today, Connor. So, can I please do the famous questionnaire, Inside the Actor Studio questionnaire, with you to celebrate your wonderful journalism?
Of course.
All right, here it goes. So folks who may not be familiar with this, but do follow 1+1, the questionnaire. This is the questionnaire that was done by first Marcel Proust, later popular French broadcaster Bernard Pivot, who passed away. Later, James Lipton, who idolized Bernard Pivot, and this is the questionnaire Lipton would do on Inside the Actor Studio. It's Chris's turn to do it, even though this is not officially 1+1. This is the Eclectic Radical. So, Chris, here it goes. What is your favorite word?
One I don't use enough because people wouldn't understand it, but it is my favorite word, ochlocracy. And I'm going to spell this.
All right.
So it's in the public chat for everyone who needs to understand it.
Okay, fantastic.
Ochlocracy. Ochlocracy is literally mob rule. Ochlocracy, the perfect ochlocratic state, is a world where everybody does whatever they want with complete freedom and no oversight and nothing that nothing is disallowed, except number one, being a bigot and violating other people's rights. Number two, trying to actually assume power over other people and therefore violate other people's rights. And three, try to politically blame certain people for the state of society as a whole for anything other than strict scientific cause and effect. This is what they did, and these were the consequences, reasons.
And that's your favorite.
And if anyone breaks any of those three rules, then the rest of society gets together and throws them out of the nearest window.
Okay, so ironically, that's your favorite word. Then what's your least favorite word?
My least favorite word is democracy, because even though I believe very deeply in democracy, in the real, literal sense that people should control government, democracy is used in a liberal and representative sense to talk about a republicanism that only supports the ruling class.
Exactly. Then what turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally, or psychologically?
Human potential.
Human potential. What turns you off then?
Misanthropy. And when I talk about misanthropy, what
Really?
I
Wow,
understand,
interesting. Okay.
what I mean when I say misanthropy is not the accepted, cranky, I don't like other people sort of misanthrope image, but rather a fundamental dislike and distrust of human capabilities, possibilities, and visions.
I know.
Anti-humanism.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. There's the misanthropy, of a George Carlin, and then there's the misanthropy of a far right
Well,
asshole. Who wants to tear you.
Even George Carlin's misanthropy in its language used to depict reality fails to be suitably propagandistic and can ultimately drive people into feeling that things are hopeless.
Yeah, yeah.
And if you believe things are hopeless, you are surrendering to misanthropy, because misanthropy is the effort to deny human agency and potential for good. The ultimate example of misanthropy in the modern world is the eco-fascist idea that we can sacrifice primarily brown and black people in the third world in order to protect what they think of as human civilization and mean a Western white civilization.
I also have that problems with the animal. I also have that problem with the fascist faction of the animal rights movement.
Well,
Then,
the animal rights movement, and a group that I would specifically classify as bourgeois white vegans, come directly from various misanthropic Nazi ideas about ecology and animal rights, as opposed to any sort of humanistic social ecology.
as the old joke goes, Hitler was a vegetarian. What's your
Hitler,
favorite?
no, actually, the fact is that Hitler tried very hard to be a vegan and kept cheating and eating meat anyway.
Well, speaking of misanthropy and curse words,
Himmler was a much better vegan than Hitler.
well, speaking of George Carlin, what's your favorite curse word?
That's hard. I'm an Anglophile in this area. I believe the term bloody is underused.
Okay. What sound or noise do you love, followed by what sound or noise do you dislike?
I like a lot of different sounds or noises. I like music. I like nature. I like a lot of different eclectic music. I will admit that I prefer vocal storytelling music to purely instrumental mood music.
Okay.
The ultimate judgment of whether a song is good or bad is whether the story makes me want to sing along or not. And it's important. The story makes me want to sing along.
Then what sound or noise do you dislike? Right-wingers?
I dislike the tone. Well, I mean, I think this broadly describes most right-wingers, but also some other people too. But there's a very smug tone of voice people get when they're talking about something that they don't think anybody really understands as well as they do. And they don't believe in other people's ability to understand what they're saying. And they're just babbling in a very meaningless way while trying to sound like they're saying something.
That's fascinating.
The biggest source of this is liberals, but they're usually doing it instead of actively fighting against something right wing.
Brilliant response. What profession, if you weren't doing yours, would you love to do?
If I weren't doing what I'm doing to make a living, I would prefer to make a living doing this.
Hey, it's independent journalism. We're like superheroes. By day we're this, by night we're that. So yeah.
Yeah, no, and I'm not a billionaire playboy, so I need help with my funding. And I don't want to take it from any of the billionaire playboys out there right now. I don't trust their motives.
Exactly. Elon Musk is not Iron Man, folks, and Bill Gates is not Bruce Wayne and Batman.
Elon Musk is, for everybody who remembers Iron Man 2, Elon Musk is Justin Hammer.
Exactly. What profession would you absolutely not want to do under any circumstances?
I wouldn't want to be a cop under any circumstances.
And lastly, we comes full circle. If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say as you arrive at the pearly gates, or whatever is your vision or belief in the afterlife? And even if you're an atheist, please do answer.
Do as thou wilt, and it harm none, and this is the whole of the law.
Brilliant. Chris, I don't know if you want to end the show or you still want to go.
No, this is actually a good place to finish up. We started off with the recent news of the Kurdish national struggle ending. We transitioned there to a good discussion about the Catholic Church and liberalism versus conservatism versus actual socialism. And once again, I will repeat, not Catholicism or Protestantism, but Anabaptism, with the understanding that by Anabaptism, I mean living your life like the world is ending. Because between climate change, between the political changes happening with capitalism, the world is ending in many ways. There will be a new world. COVID, which is still an ongoing crawl. COVID represents an end of the world that we still fail to grapple with. And we're refusing to create a new world to replace the one that it killed. So, I mean, in the end, this is my... If you are going to believe something religiously, you need to, number one, embrace the idea that the world is ending. And number two, understand heaven as the new world we create on earth and not as some hypothetical future balancing of the books after we're all dead. Heaven only comes to if we make it.
And folks, we can be heroes forever and ever. You can be Sailor Moon. You can be Batman. In fact, be a Batman because he's got no superheroes, but we can change the world.
There is no billionaire. There is no billionaire who is going to put on a costume. There is no politician who is going to cut you a new deal or write a 5-year plan. In fact, you know, for my final thoughts, I will recommend everyone to the Patreon, please. Right now, we really need patrons. If you at all support the show and could at all afford donating, please. I really hate to say it, but I do need your money right now if you can afford to pay it.
And
that said, my final thought.
Also very important, share, like, and share widely, and engage with us.
Yes, share widely, engage, help people who need help if you can afford that too, because that mutual aid is going to be fundamental to all our ideas mattering. Build communities that you think can survive the end of the world and transition into the new world. My biggest regret is that I wasn't building a community in 2020 to survive the end of the world that came in 2021. And we need to think about apocalypse and the end of the world as something that is constantly happening. And in that thought, and the fact that we don't have anyone to save us, the great John Fogerty, in the song Who'll Stop the Rain, wrote, "I went down Virginia, seeking shelter from the storm, and caught up in the fable, I watched the tower grow. 5-year plans and new deals, wrapped in golden chains. But still I wonder, who'll stop the rain."
And to quote John Lennon back there, power to the people, death to fascism, death to capitalism, death to settler colonialism, death to Zionism, death to Western imperialism.
In solidarity with the wonderful young Afrikaner youth who have chosen to make the Economic Freedom Party the party of Afrikaner Zoomers. Kill the Boer.
Death to global white supremacy, yeah, man.
On that note, I want to thank everybody who joined us and who sat through Yuri's technical difficulties and my sort of scrabbled together monologues to listen to our conversation. I hope you enjoyed it. I have a show next week with my old friend from Twitter and still Blue Sky correspondent, Cheryl Wycall. If you remember her on Twitter, you might remember her as Cheryl Ring. She is a wonderful anarchist and lawyer who recently wrote a book about her political and personal development as a trans woman in America. And so I want to talk to her. That will be the 25th. I'm still looking to book shows after that date. If you have a topic that you would like me to address with someone like Yuri or Connor, if I can remember to help them not forget, or if you have a topic that you would like to address as a guest, please feel free to DM me on Twitter or Substack or Blue Sky. I am Eclectic Radical in all those places. If you want to give money on Patreon, I am Eclectic Radical on Patreon. And until next week, we'll tweet at you.